Hi everyone! Welcome to the True Mouse Games YouTube channel. My name is Alex and I would like to talk to you today about narrative combat, what some people call a theater of the mind, versus battle maps, tactical combat as some people might call it. So first let me say I'd like to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of both approaches. And I will have to say that both approaches, even though I prefer one specifically for my own, both approaches are equally valid. There is no right or wrong way to play role-playing games, so in the end it all comes down to personal preference. That said, I will have to say that I have found that people tend to stick with the option they're most familiar with, maybe the option that they started playing with. If their first game master used Theater of the Mind, they might only always stick to Theater of the Mind without actually thinking about the strengths and weaknesses of the two options that are available, and maybe choose the one that seems better suited to their personal game style and their personal group. So in this video, I would like to go over the strengths and weaknesses of both of those styles, and hopefully it will be informative, and hopefully some of you might start thinking about which one of the two styles is better suited for their own personal group. So let's first talk about narrative combat, theater of the mind. What's one of the strengths of the system? Of course, it is cheaper. You don't need to buy miniatures, you do not need to buy battle maps, you do not need to buy all the equipment you need to create those for yourselves. On the other hand, a strength of the tactical combat, the Battlemap approach, is that you can obviously show off your cool miniatures and your cool environments. If you have watched shows like Critical Role or similar RPG shows online, you might have seen some amazing miniatures, some amazing dungeons that the dungeon masters, the game masters have created. Monsters, if you have great miniatures for them, might seem far more intimidating. There's this wow effect that cannot be underestimated when the game master pulls out a huge monster behind his GM screen and just puts it on the battle map in front of the players, especially if the player miniatures are this big and the monster is way bigger. That's something that simple narrative description cannot quite achieve in that same effect. Also, of course, you have to say that in the Battlemap's approach, the expensive miniatures and the massive terrains and all this is not 100% necessary. You can, of course, just use a sheet of paper, scribble down a few lines, and maybe use dice or small household objects to represent the monsters and the players. But, of course, there is very little wow effect in that regard. The second strength of the narrative combat approach is it is easier. It is easier to prepare for the game master. He does not have to spend preparation time in painting miniatures or drawing tactical maps on a piece of paper or on any other surface he might have acquired for that reason. And of course, he can spend the time he saves not having to create maps and monsters on other things. He can flesh out the plot a bit more, he can create more detailed NPCs, and all these things that might of course also lead to a better game. The second strength of the narrative approach is there is no pauses to set up. So the game master doesn't have to say, okay, combat starts now, let me pull out my map, put it in and put all the miniatures down, put the player miniatures down and all that. So there is no break in the story. The story flows and the combat flows much more into the adventure instead of feeling like a detached thing, like their own minigame within the RPG. Of course, that is also one of the weaknesses of the initiative system, where you have everyone have stop and roll initiative, then write down the initiative. But we'll talk about the initiative system in a different video. Also, players might be much more fixated on combat once miniatures are placed and the battle map is there. If players are in combat, it doesn't mean they have to kill and fight or fight as long as until their enemies have run off or have all been killed. there is always a non-violent approach. You can always try in the center of combat, even in the middle of violence, to find some sort of solution, a persuasion or deception or something like that. And I find that a lot of players forget about that approach completely once the battle map is there. However, one of the greatest strengths of tactical combat, of the floor plans, of the battle maps, is that it makes it much easier to keep track of many different elements and many different creatures, especially if the combat itself is a bigger one. If you have 6 or 7 player characters and then maybe 10, 12 opponents, it becomes very hard to keep track of all of them in your mind. Players might forget details. And then they might have to ask the game master about the details. How far is a monster away? Is it in cover or not? And then based on what the game master tells them, they might have to rethink their plans that they had thought about during the last couple of minutes while it was another player's turn. And this might lead to player frustration, which we of course would like to avoid in general. Another very powerful strength of the narrative approach to combat, of the theater of the mind approach, is there is no limits when it comes to the environment. If you have a fight on the dragon's back, or jumping from one flying monster or one flying thing onto the next, that sort of fantastical, complex environment is very hard to show on a floor plan. The GM would have to put in tons of work to make that work out properly and especially look good. Or imagine a moving battle, a battle between 2 coaches driving through a city, or a group of riders, the player characters on one side, some villains on the other side, riding through the city or jumping over obstacles, exchanging fire. It is very hard to keep track of that on a floor plan. Also, once the players want to leave the map, it gets tricky, because eventually you'll have to stop with the floor plan. You can't just keep drawing all the time. Players also tend to get more confined in their thinking when there is a map. They tend to forget that they can leave the map, and they tend to forget that they might be able to use things that are not on the map themselves. So they are not just confined to the terrain that they can see before them. Another strength of the tactical approach, of the battle map approach, is that the game master has less control over the whole thing, which might seem like a weird thing to say, but sometimes there can be misunderstandings in the narrative combat. Maybe the game master, in his mind, saw a monster being just out of reach of a player character, and the player character had prepared all this stuff in his turn, but now he realizes the monster is out of reach, and he was 100% sure that the game master described something in the previous round, and that in this description the monster was within reach, which can lead to frustration, and it can lead to some players getting the feeling that the game master is cheating them, trying to make things unnecessarily difficult for them. That is, of course, potential conflict that is much less likely to arise if you have a floor plan and people can count the squares, if they can figure out the distances, the angles, the line of sights, and all this thing. Of course, another positive thing about the narrative approach is that the game master can change things like terrain or items on the battlefield to accommodate player ideas. Imagine that the players are fighting a group of villains in the kitchen of a tavern, and there's a couple chairs, there's a couple of cutting boards, all these things, and all of a sudden one of the players says, "Is there a bowl with hot soup around that I might spray into my opponent's faces in my turn?" And the game master might think, "Oh, that's a great idea. Sure, there is one around," he says to the player, "go for it." And whereas if the game master has already drawn the kitchen in detail, this player might be less likely or might be unlikely to ask such a thing, because he thinks that there's everything there. Again, there is a mental confinement basically in the players' heads to what is on the terrain, whereas the game master is always happy and can much easier change the terrain and the environment itself in the more narrative approach. However, there is a downside to that, especially for players that are not quite as experienced or not quite as imaginative, I guess, in some ways. and that downside is the non-existence of items that the players can visually see in front of them all the time. That is a benefit of tactical combat. The environment is always there, and players might be prompted to use it. If they see chairs lying around or drawn onto the map, they might think of grabbing one of the chairs and smashing it onto an opponent, or tables in a living room combat environment that might be overturned to prove a barrier or some sort of cover when the villains are shooting at your players. Players might not think about these things if they cannot see them on the battle map in front of them. So also the game master has to spend far less time describing and re-describing a room if he just has a whole battle map prepared and just can put it in front of the players. But now let's come to what I think are the greatest strengths of the two systems, in my head anyway. Let's start with the tactical combat. The greatest strength of floor plans, battle maps, in my opinion, is players can judge the consequences of their actions far better just by looking at it. They do not have to ask the GM, what is the range to this opponent? Will this group of opponents be caught in my area of effect spell, or will just 2 or 3 of them be caught in it? Is there a line of sight between me and this monster? And all these things. And therefore, they can judge the consequences of their actions much easier and much quicker, and they can make plans during other players' turns, which makes the fight quicker and slightly more dynamic. And they can also, being able to judge all these things, they can fight far more tactically, which is why I call board game, the board gamey approach, so to speak, tactical combat, I guess. And it is much easier to actually have tactics when you can see if flankings are possible, or where the line of sights are, or where the attacks of opportunity might be placed, and whatnot. The greatest strength of narrative combat, of theater of the mind, in my opinion, is simply the different state of mind it puts players into. Now, if you're looking down on a battle map from up above, you're in a third-person perspective. The player might think in his head, this monster is running towards my character. It is 3 squares away, it will reach me this turn. That is something I personally do not want my players to think necessarily. What I want my players to think is, oh shit, this monster is rushing towards me, not my character that is down there. I want my players to be in the action. In their minds, they have to be in the combat. Because I want my players to be stressed, which maybe sounds weird when I say it, but combat is something that's supposed to feel so it's supposed to feel action, like a lot of action, like a choreographed, but also chaotic feeling of an action movie, where a lot of things are happening at once, and players are supposed to feel stressed. They're supposed to feel stressed about making their plans, making their decisions, and they're supposed to feel adrenaline. And when they think that they're in the head of their character, when I describe things to them in a personal basis without having a small orc figurine approaching their figurine, that allows them and forces them to become far more one with their character. Now, players might be able to switch between the 2 points of view easily, but even the most experienced players will struggle quite a lot to get into the mindset of this is me, the monster is coming at me, not it is coming at my miniature down there, and that is me down there, whereas not me right here, if you understand what I'm saying. Anyway, these were the greatest strengths and weaknesses of the combat, on the narrative and tactical on one hand and the other hand. And now, let me tell you that, as some of you might have figured by the way I'm talking, that I much prefer the narrative side of combat, even though I can definitely see the appeal and the benefits of the tactical, the floor plan type. So now let me give you a few tips on how you can run the narrative side of combat most efficiently if you want to try it for yourself, especially if you were a GM that has mostly so far been relying on floor plans and battle maps. So there's basically 6 points. Oh, there we are. 6 points of great importance when it comes to running narrative combat. Firstly, don't make it too complex. Don't make it too difficult. If you have 6 or 7 player characters, as I said before, and you have 10 different creatures that fight them, say 2 ogres, 3 orcs, 2 goblins, and a direwolf or 2, and then maybe another orc boss or something in the mix, it will be very hard for your players to remember where all these different monsters are. Is the orc boss attacking this player character, or was it an ogre? Which one of the 2 goblins is more heavily injured? Which one of the orcs might be closer to my character? And all these things, it is very hard for them to keep track of that. So if you want to run narrative combat, try to keep things a little more simple. Now, not super simple, of course, but especially with players who are not used to narrative combat, try to keep things simple at first. The second tip I can give you is describe the scene in more detail. The players do not have a floor plan, they do not have a map in front of them, so the only thing they have is your words, your descriptions of the scene. So you have to describe the scene in more detail than you would have described it if you had just pulled out the floor plan or battle map and just put it in front of them. And also repeat those descriptions often. Your players only have your words in their ears, you are their eyes, and every time they're looking around, you have to describe things. So repeat descriptions. If the players are fighting the orcs, tell them, this orc is heavily injured, the one standing right next to you. And then say this again at the time it's the fighter's turn that's standing next to the orc. The fighter might be thinking about different options, so if you try to summarize his options, basically in some way, or at least give a summarization of the battlefield at the start of the fighter's turn, it is much more likely that he will be able to act in a way he wishes, and there will be less misunderstandings between him and you. The third point is don't track movement range and don't track opportunity attacks too precisely. Your players can't see the map, and you should be more at ease with these things. If you say, okay, this player will reach the monster probably, but I'm not 100% sure, then just say, sure, you'll reach the monster. If a player asks you, is this monster in cover, and you're not sure, then say, no, it's not in cover. If a player wants to run past 2 opponents, and he might not be aware that both opponents are close enough to provoke, so that he provokes attacks of opportunity, then tell him you provoke 1 or 2 attacks of opportunity if you run past him. Do you still want to do it? Make things clear. Now, the fourth thing, what I consider quite important, that it might take a while for you to get the hang of it, is you should always try to add distinguishing characteristics to otherwise same-looking opponents. So if your group's fighting, say, 5 orcs, or say 5 bandits, you might want to say, okay, 2 bandits are armed with bows. One of them is a man, one of them is a woman. Of the 3 bandits armed with melee weapons, one of them is a big brute carrying a greatsword. One of them's ugly-looking fellow with a scarred face, and the third is a young beardless bandit that is carrying a short sword and a dagger. These descriptions, especially if you repeat them over and over, will make it easier for your characters, for your players, of course, to realize where the bandits are, which one is more injured, and so on and so on. And they will prove a far more interesting gaming experience, a far more memorable gaming experience than just Bandit 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, which are all just a stack of hit points. Now, you can still use the same stats for all the bandits, even though I like to adjust the stats for my NPCs mainly based on their weapons, and maybe give one of them a little more hit points and the other one maybe a slightly better armor, but you don't need to do that. It's more about the descriptive part of things, not so much about the rule part of things. Now, the fifth point is similar to the third point, but I would like to stress this one more time. When in doubt about things in the narrative point of combat approach, rule in the player character's favor most of the time, especially when they're trying out crazy stuff. because the crazy stuff, jumping from one rooftop on the next, hitting a guy with a hot bowl of soup, trying to leap on a running horse, things that might not be necessarily super effective from a pure rule point. These crazy things are what makes your combat memorable, what makes your combat exciting, what makes your combat seem and feel like an action movie, which is exactly what you want. And also, if you rule into the player character's favor, when you're not quite sure if you should, it will build trust. There's always some players that think that the GM might be cheating, that the GM might be out to get them, and even those who don't think that will be better players and will be more likely to give you less trouble in your group, and they will lead to a more entertaining experience for everyone if they come to trust you. And every time you rule a little bit in their favor, if it's close, they will come to trust you a little bit more. They will be aware of the GM is trying to make us heroes. He's not trying to just slaughter us with these NPCs. I'm not saying spare them by any means. If they make mistakes, even though you have repeated things a couple times, then hurt them. Kill them if necessary. But if the only mistake they have made is misunderstanding something that you might have not stressed enough, and you're not sure if you have stressed things enough in the combat, then give them the benefit of the doubt. And then last but not least, we come to the sixth point of my tips on how to run narrative combat. And the sixth point is encourage questions. As I said before, you are your player's eyes and ears. They cannot see the enemy except in their mind's eye. They cannot see a floor plan. They cannot count squares. They cannot see if someone's in range or if someone's behind cover, and so on and so on. So encourage your players to ask you questions. Make sure they understand that you will not be pissed at them if they ask you, how far is this opponent? Can I reach him in this turn? And all these things. Because only if they ask you questions can they plan properly. Now, I'm not saying have them ask you questions constantly. Eventually, you'll have to say, look, we need to keep the combat flowing. We need to keep the combat fast. But still, especially at the start, if they haven't played narrative combat for a long time, allow it. Make the combat a little slower, sure, but it will lead to less frustration. And once you and your players are on the same wavelength, because you've been playing with each other for a while, and they know your mindset and your descriptions, and they are more familiar with them, then you can start to make combat a little faster, a little easier in that regard, anyway. Alright, and that was our video about narrative combat, theater of the mind, and tactical combat on the other hand. Thank you guys for watching. If you've liked the video, please feel free to hit the like button. If you're looking forward for more of these videos, I'd like to do at least one every week from now on. Please feel free to hit the subscribe button and subscribe to our channel. And please let me know in the comments if you agree with my thoughts on the issue, if you disagree, what parts you disagree with. And also let me know if there's other things you'd like me to talk about in these this GM Musings hopefully long line of videos. I'd be happy to hear your thoughts, and I'd be happy to pick up things that people might be interested in. Thank you for watching, good luck with your games, and I'll see you on the internet.